Okay, hello and welcome everyone to our latest webinar. We're going to get started. I think there's still some people joining, so we'll catch up as they come on. Really pleased to welcome Mike Kennedy today. My name's John Labianca. We're going to be talking about what we're calling the future is now leadership redefined. So clearly a lot of content on leadership development programs. We're going to delay the bios a little bit. We're going to get engaged right away. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike. We'll do Q&A at the end. We're going to do some, if we have the time, we'll do a Q&A, but certainly you can use the chat function if you want to, chat to the organizer. That would be great.
And so as John said, we'll start off. Bonus for being here before maybe some others is that you get to make your voice heard, as they say. So I'm going to warm you up with an exercise. So this is a tool that we use in a number of our online workshops that allows us to do real-time polling, which is something that I really get a kick out of. So this is just a warm-up question, has little to nothing to do with leadership per se, right? But want to get everyone acquainted with how to do this. So if you open a separate browser window, because I know everyone shut everything else on their machines down for this session, but I'll give you permission to start up one browser window and log in. You can see, hopefully at the top of the screen, you can see the login address is pollev, pollev.com/mkennedy300. So that's my name, my first initial, last name 300. So pollev.com mkennedy300. We'll use this a number of times throughout the workshop. Once you log on, you can really bypass the login screen. You don't need to give a name. You don't need to provide any information. Just go straight through to the poll. And then once you do this, you could do it on your phone as well. All right, we've got some mastery being achieved here, which is great. Again, can do this just as easily on a device. Once you get in, you should see the 10 options listed top to bottom. So we just chose 10 states alphabetically. You can choose up to 5 of these. So this is just to familiarize you with this tool we're going to use a couple of times. And it looks like some people are getting into the flow of things here, which is fantastic. Unsurprising to see California taking a bit of a lead here on states that folks have visited. For myself, being local to Connecticut, I've driven through it plenty of times and been there many, but looks like folks have gotten a handle on the technology. So I'm going to, and as you can see, you see those results in real time, except when we get this little pop-up that annoys me. But it's okay. So let's get to the real questions here. Now that you've gotten the hang of using that, so let's find out what your thoughts are. This is just a straight, pick one answer. And we're going to find out what your thoughts are on the extent to which people managers might experience clinical depression and anxiety relative to the rest of the people in the corporate workforce. Okay, so this question is based on people in the workplace. To what extent do you think there might be elevation of these mental health challenges for people managers? And so we've got some folks chiming in with their votes. It looks like the consensus is that it might be at a bit of a higher rate, modestly higher rate, and of course, it depends how you define that higher rate, what makes it considerable or not. But the number is actually about 30 to 40% higher rates between depression and anxiety. So essentially, middle managers in particular, are the ones that were evaluated in this piece of research that wasn't done by HBR but was reported in this HBR article. About 30 to 40% elevation of risk of depression. So congratulations to all of you people managers out there. A delightful development that comes along with being promoted into a role like that, right? What else do we know about some things that affect the ecosystem of being a manager? Well, how about the employees in that ecosystem? Let's think about them for a moment. So get some thoughts on this question. What percentage of employees consider their boss the worst thing about their job? Boy, this perhaps now gets us into explanations, maybe, of some of the proneness to depression and anxiety, right? So what do we think? Looks like people are chiming in kind of that middle range there. So everyone's taking a conservative, normal curve approach on this, John. But that seems fairly reasonable, right? So it looks like we've got the majority at least between 20 and 40. And let's continue on and see now. How many, whoa, what percentage of employees would give up a pay raise, give up their next pay raise to have a new boss? Wow, that's a pretty strident question there, and so I guess that one's just no. We can't get on board with that one. It's got to be down in the lower half, right? So we've got most people picking under 30% and the majority going less than 20. So understandably, I'm getting the impression that we've got a number of managers here in the virtual room. So of course, we'll like to see those numbers being a little on the lower side, but also relevant to this, how much variance in team engagement is attributable to team leaders, right? So to what extent do the data say that a team leader, the quality of leadership being delivered by the person responsible for, the person managing a given team, how much of engagement seems to stem purely from that leader and their capabilities as a people manager? So it looks like folks think that's pretty high, which I like the fact that everyone's again presuming we've got folks here who are experienced leaders or have been in leadership roles, looking in the mirror and saying, yeah, that's something that we really have the biggest impact on. And in fact, that was the most accurate. Well, I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Let's go through the numbers. So what you'll find about me as a facilitator is that sometimes I am a liar, but only in the most positive way. And so what I lied about here was the fact that the options were only up to 50%, because in fact, what was found by Hogan, which is the assessment company, considered that really the Hogan assessment is many would consider that the gold standard of personality assessment, work-based personality assessment. Their research has that number at about 75%, 75% I think. And so certainly many of you have heard the old saw that people don't leave jobs or companies, they really leave their managers. And sometimes things are old saws because that saw cuts a lot of wood. And this is one that does cut a lot of wood. So 75% there. I lied on this one too. Yeah, percentage that would give up their next pay. Now this was a smaller scale study. This was a sample size of only about 1,000 people. And I've seen kind of retest numbers of this that put it a little below 50%. But even if that's so, I mean, my goodness, you all reacted, those of you that chimed in reacted that come on, that's got to be below 30%, and we'd love to believe it. But we underestimate, and there's a lot of data telling us this as well, that there's a lot of underestimation of the extent to which we as people managers, as leaders, create environments that people would really prefer those environments to change. That would be a bigger engager for them even than salary, which we know doesn't necessarily have as large a motivational effect day in and day out as we often believe. And then finally, the variance, you all sniffed this one out, I think, that I was actually giving you underestimates on that as well, where it is 70%. And so you put all of this together, and maybe those first two in particular give you a little bit of a sense of why some of those factors in depression and anxiety come into play, where this is hard, and this is, I'm at a point in my career in life, John's at a point in his career in life where we now see our friends, our longtime friends, having moved into leadership roles, into bigger and bigger executive roles, and behind closed doors, perhaps with an adult beverage in hand, he'll say, God, this is the hardest part of the job. This is the hardest thing that I've ever had to do in my career is to lead a team or to lead people. And also the thing for which very often we are least prepared, for better or for worse. We still live and work in an environment where the selection process for who becomes a manager often doesn't really map to the things that give people the best chance of being successful as a manager. And so that's where people like John, people like me come in, hopefully, to the picture to try and at least get people into a position where they are they're most comfortable and most capable, right, in taking on those roles that they may not have been all that prepared for. And one's never fully prepared in many ways for the role, because as you'll see, there's a different definition of good leadership for each leader on any given day. And that's why there can be 70,000 books, last I checked, in print, in English print, available on leadership that you could buy right now, right? Because there's no right answer, because every day brings a new right answer. And so let me just very quickly, as we continue on, introduce my co-facilitator, John Labianca. John's training academically is as an industrial psychologist, which he brought into roles you can see in the financial industry at the start of his career. John's had a remarkable career leading just about every function there is to be led in the world of HR, or people and culture, as many now call it. And he then took his skills, as we said at the MBA, took his skills from the financial sector to the NBA, where he led, again, a number of practice areas under human resources. But I came to know him as the head of learning and development when I started there. John made I was about to say mistake, he can decide, but of hiring me, and that's where we got to know each other. But in the last few years, as we've started our post-NBA careers, John now leads the human capital practice at the STI group. So John, lovely to see you here.
Yeah, thank you. That slide was up entirely too long. And that thing I'm wearing around my neck is called a tie, for those who haven't seen one of those in
Oh my goodness, that's
several
still a thing.
years. So happy to have Mike. I'm so happy that Mike and I are working again together after, our stints at the NBA. Mike cut his teeth a little differently than me. He's more on the clinical side. As you could already tell, very intelligent gentleman, having been educated at the likes of Brown. I always tell him, well, I went to school in New Haven as well, but it wasn't at Yale, unfortunately. So, the greatest letter I ever received for an application was Mike's letter when he wrote to us to join the NBA. We talk about it to this day, and part of the reason why I hired him. So, again, fortunate to have him. He's worked at big the big consulting firms and everything in between. So he's now started his own consultancy, Gray Henley Learning, and like I said, very fortunate to be working with him again. We've already delivered a few things to some clients, and we're having fun at it again. So
Yeah.
Michael drive mostly today, but we'll do future seminars where we do partner more completely. So let me just give you a sense of the quick agenda. I know we don't have an agenda slide, but we're going to provide bits and pieces of content from several of the programs. So everything is customizable. Everything is, we work together to make sure that our clients, have a solution that kind of is relevant. And certainly there's some relevant leader development programs right now, which may have changed and may be different over the past 15 months. So I think it's really exciting to see, what we're focusing on. I mean, we're going to talk about delegation, which I always tell Mike, of the 45 people that I coach, that is the number one action item on any of those plans is delegation. I don't care how high level you are in the organization, how if you're C-level or not, delegation seems to be on the vast majority of plans. We're going to do development coaching, why it's important, especially now. Feedback. We'll cover a little bit on feedback, which has really looked very different over the past 15 months, as everyone can imagine, without the face-to-face, right? Then we'll cover what we call Team Performance Predictors. I think you'll find these really interesting. Mike and I do work with intact work groups and teams as well for team dynamics and things. And then we're going to finish up with challenging conversations, which, of course, is everyone's favorite. So who doesn't like to have a challenging conversation? I got 3 of those this afternoon. I think I'm on my agenda.
And those are only the ones you know about.
Exactly, the ones that haven't even popped up. So, there is another bonus at the end. Mike's going to provide some general learnings and insights from, him and I keeping our ears open over the past 15 to 20 years. So, we'll finish up with that. But a lot to cover with the balance of the hour. So I'll turn it right back over to Mike.
Yeah, and we're also going to ratchet it up here as we talk about, as John said, delegation as a starting point, which is really the just such a common theme, and a common theme across levels of experience, across levels of seniority, where it seems like each transition in a career brings a whole new set of challenges around how to delegate and what it means for you to delegate. So I'm going to drop us right in. This is I'm using something called in media res. This is a kind of soft open, right? Trying to build up a little drama here, like they often did on Breaking Bad and some other shows, where you start the show in the middle of the episode on some level, and then go back to see how things got there, right? So they did that right out of the gate. So I'm following that lead, probably in a less exciting way, but dropping us straight into the middle of what people will often see in a learning experience designed around delegation and building delegation knowledge and skill use. So one of the long-standing models that's helped inform good leadership practice, I'm sure some of you have heard of or are familiar with situational leadership, and that's a 50-year-old theory that 50, yeah, just right around 50, that's evolved over time, developed by some very early practitioners of what we'd call management theory, and that's some of the elements of that have really become just canon for leader development and how we think of leadership. Again, there's been a fair amount of evolution as well, so we don't entirely ride with the formal old version of SL. We think we've evolved a little bit beyond it in some ways, but there's still some really important takeaways to extract from that we bring in when we talk about delegation, and just the word situational really gets at that as we'll see really in everything we discuss, the idea that there is a one-size-fits-all solution is maybe the most misguided thing that people sometimes bring into leadership. Again, the idea that there is a way to do it, because there are too many people, too many differences among the people that we're leading, and there's again a great body of research that demonstrates that. So this is what Ken Blanchard and Paul Hersey, who developed situational leadership way back when, were first onto, that we have to think less about a this is how you do it approach, and more about a we have to adapt how we do it based on the circumstances. And that's very much at the heart of delegation, and what makes delegation the top of everyone's list, as John said, because you can't, what worked yesterday, even with the same person, might not work today, and it might not even work across different things that you're delegating to them, right? So we always want to approach this with the mindset of analysis, right? Of however it is that you're going to, whatever it is that you're going to delegate, whatever the outcomes you want to see are, you do need to actually do a certain amount of analysis. And that's what, again, I appreciate the fact that there's been greater and greater recognition that the business side of management needs to factor in the psychology side of management as well. And so, that's where you get folks like John and me with that background coming in and saying, theory is all fine and good, but you have to understand the people that you're enacting the theory with, right? So a step of delegation and building those skills is always, and this, as I said, is mid-episode, right? Because it's always going to be looking at the people you're leading, at the situation that they're in, and then formulating your plan. So we would explain a lot of those moving parts, and then from here on out, it would be the formulation of the plan that would really kick in. Going back more to things that we do early in a session like this that kind of set people up to understand what might be getting in the way. We certainly always want to address barriers, right, and understand, because if people are coming in saying I'm struggling with delegation, what's going on, right? Why is that so persistent and such a common theme? And so we always want to challenge people to examine what you can't solve a problem if you haven't at least done some due diligence on the source of the problem. But what we find, I know John will heartily second this motion, is that we hear, there are kind of two categories of answers, and one set of those answers is true answers, right? That may even be outside of one's control. So, resource limitations, skill sets of people. I mean, there are certainly things we don't want to pretend as if everything is completely resolvable, because there are true challenges. But there's also that second category, which really just comes down to one big thing, which is when we said, why don't you delegate that much? And we always have to see how long it takes for us to get to the elephant in the room about that question, because the answer to that is invariably trust, right? That for sure there are, again, organizational barriers, there might be institutional barriers, there can be things that are realistic barriers to delegating more, but there is always a percentage, and sometimes a fairly large percentage, of withholding delegation that does amount to a lack of trust and an unwillingness to embrace the trust that's required
Yeah.
in order to move things forward. And you've got to move things forward, because John, I know you love this slide. I'm gonna tap out and let you
Yeah, no,
explain
and
why
I
it's so
was just
simple,
going
right?
to add about my experience with this action item on development plans. And I've dealt with so many leaders that now are so jaded by the topic that they don't even give anybody a chance. You ask questions like, "Well,
Yeah,
tell me about when you got burned there, and tell me about a recent example of when you tried to delegate." "Oh no, I don't do it anymore. I don't trust any. I don't want to deal with that anymore because I've been burned and I'm the one held accountable." And you hear things like that. So, and this ROI slide is part of the reason why. The time between the effort right away, which the blue dots show, like you're going to have to tell somebody what and how to do it, right? Especially if they don't
right.
know. And then there's going to be some time when they're starting to learn a little bit, but you still have to be very much involved until that curve bends a little bit and still not as productive as you like. And it takes a little while before the green part, which is, hey, they're now doing what you delegated. And so, I think the ROI is there, and then but you just have to invest
Yeah,
some important time into that process. And when you get to those higher levels, your leaders at those levels, they just don't feel like they have the time because the world's closing in. They got a million things to do. It's easier to just do it myself. So I think
yeah,
that's why I do love this slide. It just gives a visual representation of the actual, and we deal with this here at my company too. When you onboard somebody, if you don't get onboarding right and put that red time in and understand, not everybody just
yeah.
starts green. Oh, can you hit the ground running? Well, what does that even mean? You have to understand the company culture. You have to understand what the what the product and deliverables and services are, whatever your company does. So I think it's really important to understand this.
Yeah. Almost everything that we touch on in leadership, every topic has usually some myth that goes along with it, right? Some big myth and just dispelling that is part of putting the solution in place. And the big myth with delegation is that idea that it saves you time, and that's what it's there for, right? And if you're using it in a way that, and yes, it should save you time. That's the whole point, is that we want to get leaders freed up to do the most important work, so that they're not stuck in the weeds of doing things that they were doing before they were in the role that they might be, or the scope of role that they're in now. But that's contingent on their ability to develop people. But the big myth is that you can just hand those things off, and it's going to save you time the minute you do it, right?
Mhm.
And that's where those folks have gotten burned, is not doing
Right.
analysis and understanding that
Delegation
there has
versus
to be.
dump, right?
Yeah,
That's what we
exactly.
call
And there has to be some staging too. You can only be working on getting people proficient in so many things at a given time, because you're investing time, right? So that's the big myth. The big mistake is saying, well, I'm just moving this off my plate, as opposed to, I'm taking on more in the short term, because that enables me to offload in the longer term, right? So So it's again, it's not as easy as a quick explanation, and that's why we spend time on this process of analysis and on getting people to look in the mirror and to say what is it that I'm hung up on? Why am I not able to trust my people? If I've brought in, listen, I probably seen the meme quote attributed to Steve Jobs. I'm never particularly believing of a thing in a meme with a picture or whatever that it actually is a quote from the person. But the quote's still a good one, even if they attach it to Steve Jobs kind of randomly. But it's that quote about, why would I hire really smart people and then tell them how to do their jobs, or something to that effect. And that's the reality that many of us wrestle with. And so we do have to, if there is a solution, part of the solution has to be building trust, right? So it's challenging people, and challenging people just one step at a time, right? This is the old joke: how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Well, how do you build trust? One investment at a time, as you move down the path of delegation, right? Um, so our bridge then from delegation is, and as we said, this is we're going to cover a lot of ground here, so we want to introduce just the idea of what the experience that people have in any of our modules and any of our workshops. And so delegation is often a starting point, again, because it's so common. Coaching is something, or development coaching. And John, you keep me honest on this, that because we've said, I never want to fall into the trap of just saying coaching when we're
Yeah.
talking about it as a leadership practice, or as a manager's practice, right? Because as John said, John's an executive coach. I don't do as much, but I do some executive coaching as well. Coaching is a thing, and there's other types of coaching, sports coaching, many people are familiar with, and we don't want to give the impression that the leaders, or the people leader, the people manager's approach to coaching is just meant to be replicating what an executive coach does, right? And in fact, I would say there's been a little bit of an oversimplification or an exaggeration of this notion of coaching being the heart of good leadership. It can be. Again, though, that just presumes that there's a one size fits all. So there has been a little bit of a rush, I would say, to embrace coaching as the solution for good leadership. And again, anytime, to the point that I've actually tried to train myself to say, and you can see I'm still working on it, to say leader development rather than leadership development, because I don't know for any of you folks what being a good leader is going to look like, because I don't know the people you lead. So there can't be a do this solution, right? It's always working with our clients to help find the thing that's going to make them the most effective leaders in their environments and in their situations, right? Now, so sometimes that is coaching. Don't get me wrong. What we've seen is that coach-like behavior, right, or development coaching by a people manager is a very, very powerful tool. It may be the most important or the most potentially productive approach to leadership, the one that has the greatest benefits across the range of the most people. But I very early in my career had an experience. My own natural inclination, I tend to be a little bit more of a coach type manager. And very early, I mean, in my very early days, 3 years out of college, when I was in mental health services, you can advance very quickly in a career where people burn out at a prolific rate, right? So I was leading a team, just a couple of years out of school, and was a lousy, some of my team loved me. I know a couple of them really struggled under me, and eventually joined another team and did much better. And it was very clear that was because, very clear to me, retrospectively, that it was because I was trying to force a coaching approach on them when they needed something different where they were at that point in their own careers. And so we heartily endorse the practice of development coaching, and this gets somewhat to why it has become as if not prevalent, because I still don't think it's adopted by as many leaders as would be ideal, but at least why it's grown in prevalence within the world of leader development as a critical tool in the toolkit, right? Because we are past a time when most workers in the knowledge economy are simply executing relatively binary or straightforward solutions, right? This is known as algorithmic tasks, when really just replication of the thing that your boss used to do was probably the most the easiest path to success. And that's just no longer the case. The world, and especially in the knowledge economy, has just become too complex. And in those circumstances, Sebastian Salacru, who's a well-known, I think, Australian, but in industrial psychology, psychologist and management consultant, wrote very well about this, that we're in a world where the simple expectation for any set of reasons, but all of them involving the degree of complexity that exists in our work lives now, it's just is very unrealistic to think that a hierarchical system of command and control is going to get results under those conditions, right? So, and many, not all, but many authorities on leader behavior would say that that the distinction between management and leadership is one where it's either command and control management, right? Operational, it's the minimize decision making by the person being managed, as opposed to leading, where it's giving people the tools to make decisions and applying influence rather than authority, right? And so increasingly, that latter path is the one that seems to lead to more significant results. That said, again, keep in mind, that last point is one. As I said, I've done seminars. In fact, I did a certification program a couple of years ago with some folks who were experienced learning leadership development practitioners, a couple of people with advanced, in some cases more advanced than my degrees in some of this stuff, who said, "Wait a minute, it says at the bottom there that coaching, like we thought that coaching is good leadership." No, because for example, a coach like John, like me in our coaching relationships, you're almost supposed to be a blank slate, and we know that, again, everything is variable, but that in most managerial relationships, some reciprocity is necessary, right? Some sharing of your own challenges, your own journey, your own ways that you learned. Those things are important. Showing some vulnerability. An executive coach, like, it's not my job to show vulnerability to my clients, right? But as a leader, as a people manager, it is your job in certain circumstances to show. We know that that showing some vulnerability is a predictor of building successful teams, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So coaching is, there are some misconceptions, but it is about focusing on goals and interests. It's not squishy stuff. John, I know is particularly conscientious about this. Like, there's meant to be rigor. There is meant to be some accountability built in. So it's not about just soothing people's feelings and making them feel good. It is about creating concrete goals and planning to work toward those goals, right? So just ensuring that people have a good foundation for what's going on in a coach-like approach that a leader might use. But and again, we know that when workplaces have more coaching capability or more coach-like skill capability, that those organizations do tend to be more successful, right? That benchmarks on organizational performance, on shareholder value, there's been a fair body of research that makes it pretty clear that the capability, again, not that it's a one size fits all, but that using more coaching in leadership practice is a successful path to greater productivity.
And Mike, I
So,
see that across clients. I think until
yeah,
for those who haven't been in the consulting world, where you see across many different workplaces and you get to know different cultures at the level that Mike and I work at, you see it. You see whether that's ingrained into the culture or
yep,
not. and whether those kinds of practices are rewarded and encouraged rather than not. And I do
Yeah.
feel, I don't have the metrics per se. Mike has all the data, but I see it. I know, and a coaching culture is, they do have more engaged people. They do have, you know, people who are on development tracks, people who are really, um, you know, just so much more involved in the day-to-day business. It's quite stark.
Yeah, it really is. And you see indicated it's probably not, well, certainly not been true in the last year. There was a very expensive, among other things, management consultant and organizational psychologist who swore, this was, I think, mentioned in Freakonomics, that he could tell just from companies, depending on where they were located, but he could see from in the parking lot, there were ways he could tell if there was a good culture of organizational engagement and leader engagement and using coaching practices just by the fact that you could tell people parked front out so they could get the hell out of the place. Like, you could actually see how the cars are parked and predict how little coaching practice was being used in the company, which you know, I'll take his word for it. And I'm not a word taker for it. Anyway, sorry, I flipped off before. Just reiterating, you know, that coaching is still a solution, an approach. It's not applicable to every level of employee or in every situation, right? So we do, part of learning how to be a strong development coach as a people manager is recognizing when that's the right intervention to use, not assuming that it's always the right intervention to use, right? Some data, the Blanchard Company, which is one of the companies that does situational leadership, has found that 50% or more of people are doing work at this doer level, which is the one that's most appropriate for coaching, which probably does help explain why it has risen to the top as a technique or an approach that does have great results attached to it. Woven into coaching also, I don't think, I suppose there could be some circumstance where I would be delivering coaching workshop or some content on coaching without doing something on feedback as well. But I have a very hard time stretching my brain to the point where I can imagine that being the case, because feedback is so fundamental to the coaching process. And I think people, again, will say, well, but coaching, even if it's not quote unquote warm and fuzzy and does have some rigor and accountability built into it, but feedback, you know, we still hear that word and get that kind of jolt of like, well, it's a negative experience or a negative thing, and that's part of the myth of feedback, right? I said myths associated with a lot of these practices, and we jump straight to. I'm working with a client now, and I did focus groups earlier this week where when I asked about, you know, and it was saying talk about developmental feedback, and everyone just immediately jumped to talking about performance appraisals. Oh, I shouldn't say everyone. The focus group that was about the managers. So later today, I'll be debriefing with the executive team of that company, and this will come up, right? But we don't, you know, the word is so fraught in so many ways. And yet we forget. Well, in fact, I'm not going to let you forget, because I'm going to return to our polling technology. So some of you that have come on since the first time we used this, I'm not going to take the time to get you all up to speed. I apologize, but you'll get to see others using it, or maybe you'll figure it out on your own, right? But I do, when we broach the subject of feedback, always like to hear from people. Whether they like to get feedback, whether they're more inclined to receive it or not, and there's actually, this is very consistent. So thanks for folks who are chiming in. Fairly consistent, I think, probably 25%, and again, we're in the small sample size territory and also have the benefit of anonymity, because I always do suspect that the percentage of the second is a little bit higher than what's actually reported, even if it is anonymous. We know that there's survey bias. But this is pretty consistent. The majority and the large majority of people say, no, I need feedback. Feedback is what helps me grow, helps me be successful, right? And there's, again, I happen to think that that's the surveying on it is a little bit skewed because of what's called aspiration bias, but even taking that out of the equation, like the results are clear enough that we see that people do generally feel like feedback is important and they want it. So, but that stands in contrast to the second question. And these I've asked these questions in rooms of anything from a dozen to hundreds of people, and gotten the show of hands, either put up your left hand or your right hand, right? So again, this group's results were very consistent with the first one. And this group's result thus far, anyway, with whatever number of precincts have reported, this is the most common answer to this question, right? Usually it's a little more mixed, but this is the most, much more often than not, we see the second one on this list being the answer that people give. And so that's part of that probing at the mythology of feedback, right? Where there's a lot of that bias of saying, well, I want it, but others might not, right? and even when there's all this evidence, we have something, there's some emotional component to this that prevents us from embracing the reality that people want feedback and it's to their benefit, and they know that it's to their benefit. And yet we still struggle often to give it as often as we should, as the majority of folks here, again, have corroborated. So always, part of the journey is to understand why that is, what gets in the way, and then we want to get at how to overcome that. Now, I'll tell you very quickly that there's been some really interesting research and writing lately. An acquaintance of mine, Sheila Heen, who wrote the book Thanks for the Feedback, along with Douglas Stone. Sheila and Doug are from the Harvard Negotiation Project. Really got at the psychology of this, even though they're interestingly lawyers. So I'm really jealous that people from outside our field, John, got to something that I never figured out. But really addressed the emotional component of feedback and why it's so hard to receive it. And it explains why, listen, I don't entirely agree with this, but Marcus Buckingham and Ashley Goodall, who are people analytics experts, management consultants, authors, the very highly respected authorities in the subject matter, have said, stop giving negative feedback. Just stop, because or critical, shouldn't even say negative, but because all feedback, when it's with good intentions, is positive, right? But stop giving critical feedback, because it just does like maybe it can do good, but we don't see it. Now, I can't go that far down the road, because I think what they're getting at, though, is that it's just not done well. and the part of not doing it well is not recognizing the things that Sheila and Doug Stone talk about, which are these barriers to receiving it. It's the truth barrier, the relationship barrier, and the identity barrier. And I'm just giving you the little taste there, y'all. I'm not explaining those. You'll have to come back for more, just because they're very complicated to explain, though, as well. But when you get acquainted with them, you realize, holy cow, no wonder it's hard to give feedback, because it's hard to get feedback, and we don't see results from it because we very often deliver it without having factored in those things that prevent it from getting through to the recipient, right? And that's what makes it feel like, well, why did I bother? So we help people understand how they need to design their feedback, that it really does require some planning and preparation to be delivered right, which doesn't mean that you have the right to wait, X amount of time. Like, you still want to make it timely and deliver it fairly quickly, because otherwise you're going to just trip one of those triggers, actually. But you do want to at least put some thought and preparation into delivering critical feedback. And you also want to think over time about the extent to which you're delivering it in balance with positive feedback. And so this is our little color-coded way of reminding people that like it or not, this is all, again, research tells us that this is true. So we can sort of complain about it being true, but it doesn't change the fact that it's true, that one of the mitigating factors in giving feedback is, have you given at least an equal amount of reinforcing, positive, complimentary feedback. Because if you haven't, then we fall again into the Buckingham camp of don't bother, because it is literally true that for many people, not all, again, people are all different, and we have to factor that in, but for many people, critical feedback will literally be ignored. I mean, they might have the conversation, but they won't act on it if they haven't received at least, and probably more than at least, an equal amount of recognition of some kind, right? Again, like it or not, that we know this is a performance factor. And so knowing as a, I can't believe people, God, it's G.I. Joe, how many years ago was that? But knowing is, as they say, half the battle. And and knowing some of the other performance predictors is also more than half the battle. And so, for individual recipients of feedback and coaching, that balance of have they received an equal amount of appreciation or appreciative feedback, that's a predictor of whether the critical feedback is going to get through and drive performance, right? When we think more on a team level, just to acquaint you with some of those factors, what they come down to, now this is a point I've made several times, those of us that work in this field of leader development know there's been a fair amount of writing lately on how poorly leadership development is going in many corners of the world, and that CEOs don't feel like the efforts we're making in leader development are as successful as they'd like them to be. Now, in a moment, I'll show you that maybe CEOs aren't always the best judge of that, but there has been a fair amount of again. Acknowledgement that not all the leader development has been created equal. I like to think that ours rises above, and I'll tell you why it rises above in a moment. But there has been this certain amount of re-examining leader development and what it should look like. At the same time, some of the more rigorous academic meta research, and I won't bore you with the explanation of that term, but there is a good reason to think that it is more successful than maybe CEOs are giving it credit for. Certainly, there are correlations between leader development, the extent to which companies embrace and practice leader development, and the success of those companies. So there are some good academic resources that have made a strong research-based case that what we do is important. So I would submit that the reason that books like Barbara Kellerman's, you saw a couple of her earlier titles, and Kellerman is a Harvard, I think she's a public policy professor specializing in leadership, but she's written 2 books about how crappy leadership can be and how bad leadership development sometimes is. But what she gets at is something you've heard us emphasize, which is that it's the problem with leader development is often that it's approached first off reactively rather than proactively, right? Where no one starts thinking about developing their leaders until they're already leaders, as opposed to, say, the military, which is the one institution that really makes it more of a, from the get-go, identify them early, train them extensively. But followers matter. Who you're leading matters. Where you're leading matters. And bad leadership matters. In other words, and especially a lot of the books out there are on, here's how to be a great leader. And Kellerman's point, which I've truly embraced, believe me, is, well, let's start with not doing bad stuff. Like being great might start, at least in part, with not doing no unforced errors, right? The tennis term, let's stop part of getting on the good path is getting off the path of doing dumb stuff as a leader.
That's very true. Very true, Mike. It's right? Amazing. I mean, unforced errors, I call them derailers. The derailers in my practice, but they're out there.
And it dovetails, so, love or hate him, listen, Google is, what we know also is that this stuff mostly happens at the team level. It's, we'll say, a company has good leadership, good, bad leadership, but really people have very different experiences at the team level. And so Google's research, extensive internal, this was a hailed piece of research that they did, and I think rightly so. And they were surprised when they did this deep research on their workforce to find what made the highest performing teams. And the answer was that it doesn't really matter who's on the team, how smart they are, how experienced they are, what their, personality assessments say about them, like all these characteristics that we often think are the things to get a team together to be successful. And what matters is what they do. In other words, how they interact with each other. Now, who they are may influence that, to be sure, but ultimately, the only things that they could factor analyze as predicting high performance were, first and foremost, and if this was a true list, it would be like 1 through 10 psychological safety, because that's how high above everything else it was. And then things like, well, dependability, which relates in that, like, can I count on my teammates? Psychological safety is more, lots of literature out there on that. Amy Edmondson is the best known writer and researcher on the subject. But it's the sense to which, is this an environment where we seek to elevate each other? Like, do we understand, if we give each other feedback, do we understand that we do it as colleagues because we're hoping to elevate rather than diminish one another? I think that's the simplest account that I can give, is that idea of elevating. Everyone on the team is there to contribute to one another's success, period, and we get that, period, right? So we talk about these components of what builds successful teams. I like to get into psychological safety with case studies, and this goes back to Kellerman's bad leadership. This is the simplest version of an exercise that I have lots of variations of, but it's sort of scoring this and saying, what are the things that are contributing to diminished psychological safety, or what are the things that, if this character's boss doesn't address, that are going to chip away at psychological safety and thus chip away at productivity, right? And they can be very subtle. First time I put this in front of John, showing his experience and expertise, immediately identified, like, oh, see, it's the copies, it's the CCs here that really, put this over the line. So we know this isn't just someone who's being very candid with a trusted colleague, but rather doing something that does bring in some diminishing of a colleague instead, right? So so that approach really does help us get at those issues. And then finally, just a quick wrap up of the modules here to transition into a final couple of comments. Challenging leader conversations, often that's just bringing in the pieces around feedback around, because what we've seen over many years and many clients is that we want to learn more about how to have challenging conversations. A big portion of that is just not being comfortable with the feedback component that's almost always woven into those conversations.
Conflict. That's right? Mostly what it is.
Yeah. And so we do then factor that in and say, but let's talk about what that means for specific types of conversations, like performance conversations, like development conversations, right? So really that's a big part of the approach, is just making that bridge to feedback, and the right kind of feedback to give in those conversations. There are a few other techniques that involve just preparedness and mindfulness. And I know mindfulness is a buzzy word that people sometimes get a little like, oh, that's hippy dippy. Mindfulness as a management practice is actually an important one, just because preparation and reflection are so often, whatever we can teach in a given session, preparation and reflection are the true teachers. Like, we can help you learn how to do that in the best possible way for challenging conversation. But the act of preparing and the act of reflecting, those are the things that are actually going to make you better at them over time. Right? I often say to people, I can't make you a better leader, better at this thing in 90 minutes. I can give you the tools to go out and practice it and make yourself better over time. And just a couple of last comments. This is special bonus content. John mentioned, for people that are leaders of leaders, which may or may not describe, some of you, but it comes back to that idea. We don't just want to give plug and play. Like, we're not just going to drop. Like, I find it somewhat unconscionable to say, we're just going to come in and do our standard leadership training, because, as you heard, there's no standard leadership environment. Like, there's no such thing. It's your environment. We need to know it a little bit. Part of that challenge and part of the reason that that's so is that we often think of developing people, developing leader skill as filling a gap, a skill gap, and getting people from point A to point B. So it might be on feedback. We need to get you from where you are now, build the skills so that you're at point B. But what that doesn't factor in is that there's also a reinforcement gap, right? So if I get you from point A to B in skill, but there's nothing to reward you for practicing that thing at point B, then that's going to revert to the mean very quickly, right? There's nothing to sustain that behavior. So this is why, we feel like, we have to engage with the organization, not just come in and say, we're going to teach this thing, but we need to understand how people are reinforced, what they're rewarded for. We might need to help you understand how to reward them and reinforce them for the things that we know will predict better team performance. Listen, these 4 things, I think if any given manager does nothing more than these 4 things: listen more, trust more, care more, understand why people make decisions they make, why they choose certain courses of actions, or certain approaches, they will be drastically better. Just do these 4 things. These are also the things that are least frequently reinforced, right? Think about a manager's year-end, even that's a whole subject, but there's not a rating for listens more,
Right.
right?
And Mike,
And so you've got to think about how to make it woven in.
yeah, and I was going to always add here, Mike, that for those of you who know me, you know how important EQ is to my model and my practice. And if you look at that list, very heavily EQ, emotional intelligence type,
Yeah,
trusting and listening and caring. Those are the that's why EQ is such an important part of effectiveness. And so, I think they dovetail together. And we have separate EQ modules as well that we do. Mike and I are both, certified in that. So,
yeah. And it's what, just as a last example, when we work with an organization, my ultimate hope is that we can, design solutions across levels again, and not just say, so for your more, line manager level, we might need to think more about self-mastery and early leadership, but we also want to be all the way at the top end. Maybe the way to ensure that the reinforcement is there is by doing some, some work around culture and around understanding their executive leaders' cultural influence, right? So, a range of what we can do with any of this work, but it is stuff that we certainly love to do, and I didn't leave a lot of time for Q&A, although I'm not rushing off. John, what do you say? Officially wrap up this
yeah,
part and
I
say
think
anyone
so.
that
We're
wants to
right at the
stick
top of
around?
the hour. So
Yeah,
perfect timing. Yeah, I know we didn't get to too much Q&A. Nothing really came in on the chat other than some comments on your reference to GI Joe was appreciated by some of the people. Yeah, this is like the end of PTI, right? When they go through all the
yeah,
all
yeah.
the errors and the things.
The mailbag. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so a lot of just thank yous, and so we are always available. We're gonna wrap up. We're always available. Thank you, Mike, for joining today.
Yeah, thanks a
Any
lot.
follow-up questions, just let us know. We'll be happy to walk through, have an exploratory meeting. This is what we do. So feel free to reach out. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Bye.